Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, I speak with Johns Hopkins researchers Allison Gemmill and Suzanne Bell about their new study looking at how laws that restrict access to abortion impact the rates of infant mortality. Let's listen. Suzanne Bell and Allison Gemmill, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call. Today, we're talking about your research looking into the impacts of abortion restrictions on infant mortality. But let's start out with some specifics. We're talking specifically here about Texas and about Senate Bill 8. So, Suzanne, could you give us a little bit of background on this particular piece of legislation?
Sure. Thanks, Lindsay. Happy to be here today to discuss this with you. So Texas Senate Bill 8 went into effect in September 1st, 2021, and it prohibited abortion after embryonic cardiac activity, and that can occur as early as 5 to 6 weeks gestation. And the bill did not have an exemption for congenital anomalies, which are detected later in the pregnancy. And at the time SB 8 passed, it was the most restrictive abortion law in the country, as this was before the Supreme Court's 2022 Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization decision. This law, we have evidence now, has led to immediate and significant decreases in facility-based abortions provided in the state, more requests for medication abortion pills to self-manage one's abortion, and greater than expected live births among people residing in Texas, as work Allison and I have done previously demonstrated.
And Allison, would you walk us through sort of what was your approach and what were kind of the big takeaways of this study?
Sure. So what we did is we used birth certificate data from Texas and several other states in the United States, and we were interested in looking to see what would have happened to infant mortality in the absence of this policy. And so we used some methods, including a synthetic control method. But basically, the big takeaway is that we found an unexpected increase in Texas, so about a 13% increase in infant mortality that wasn't observed in the rest of the United States. So this was suggesting that really it was the policy that was driving this increase in infant mortality. We also saw similar findings with neonatal mortality, which are deaths to very young infants, so less than 28 days old. And then what we also found that was a bit surprising was that deaths due to congenital anomalies rose by 23% in Texas, while in the rest of the United States, there was a decrease in these deaths. And these deaths are really important because they're the leading cause of infant mortality.
So let's break down some of this data. First of all, could you said that neonatal, there's a difference between that and maybe the other groups. Can you just break down the ages that we're talking about here?
Sure. So infant deaths are those that are going to occur before 1 year of age. And then neonatal deaths, which actually make up about 60% of all infant deaths, are those that occur at less than 28 days. And those are much more common.
And then, Allison, I want to pick up on something you said here. You mentioned that congenital abnormalities were a major driver of this. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what that means?
Yeah, so we think that prior to the implementation of SB 8, birthing people that were carrying fetuses diagnosed with these severe congenital anomalies had the option to terminate the pregnancy. And this option is often exercised when the anomalies are incompatible with life or would result in significant suffering or health complications for the child. So we think that with the restrictive abortion ban in place, birthing people were all of a sudden not able to legally terminate pregnancies, even if severe congenital anomalies were detected. So as a result, these pregnancies were likely carried to term, and this probably led to an increase in births of infants with these severe congenital anomalies that died shortly after birth.
And just to clarify, Allison, these are conditions where in other places people would be counseled with the option to terminate. So these are pregnancies where the person knew that something was wrong, knew that there was a high chance of potential mortality, and was still carrying the pregnancy to term anyway. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. And so these would be complications that you would think of like heart defects, neural tube defects, and other life-threatening conditions that would, again, not be compatible with life. And so these infants, once born, would probably die shortly after birth.
And to you, Suzanne, previously we talked to you about the consequences of abortion restrictions from this particular Senate Bill 8 and your research that found that it led to nearly 9,800 more babies being born. And we'll include a link to that research in the show notes. So why the question of infant mortality? What is the connection here with abortion access?
Yeah, that's a great question. Given we had observed more births than anticipated in Texas after SB 8 was imposed, we suspected that there could be downstream effects of this policy on infant health outcomes as a result of a few potential mechanisms. The main potential mechanism, or most obvious one, linking abortion restrictions to an increase in infant death is through an increase in deaths involving congenital malformation, which Allison has just described. And as pregnant people are forced to continue pregnancies diagnosed with these fetal defects, we might then expect to see a greater share of live births that are experiencing these sorts of fetal malformations, congenital malformations that are associated with high risk of infant death in that first year and really in that first 28 days of life. And deaths involving congenital malformations are the leading cause of infant mortality in the U.S., as Allison mentioned. They account for more than 20% of infant deaths. Abortion restrictions can also lead to greater infant mortality simply as a result of more pregnancies being carried to term, and thus more infants at risk of death. And the final mechanisms that I would want to highlight are the possible increase in financial and emotional stress among pregnant people and a shift in the composition of those giving birth that would tend to include more disadvantaged groups who are unable to overcome the barriers imposed by these abortion restrictions, which may increase exposure to known risk factors for infant mortality. And even prior to SB 8 and Dobbs more recently, there was some evidence of a relationship between abortion restrictions and infant death, which we were kind of exploring further. And in that evidence, we saw that states that are hostile to abortion or that have a greater number of abortion restrictions had higher infant mortality rates. But these studies were not able to causally attribute this difference in infant death to the policy's imposition directly.
And you mentioned that there was potential for higher exposure to certain things. Could you explain what a few of those things might be?
Just specifically that the people experiencing unintended pregnancies or in pregnancies that are diagnosed with one of these fetal abnormalities would then be experiencing greater stress, emotional stress, financial stress. And we know that these things may increase exposure or may increase risks for infant mortality. And then also in the U.S., we know that there are disparities in infant mortality. For example, non-Hispanic Black women have more than 2 times the rate of infant death than Hispanic and non-Hispanic white women. And so if these populations are also those most likely to struggle to overcome barriers to abortion ban, you have this shift in the composition of the population that is having births in this case in Texas, that would tend to have a larger share of disadvantaged or minoritized groups, which already are at an increased risk of infant mortality.
All of this research is really pointing out the fact that this legislation has a real world impact on people's health. And I mean, infant mortality is a pretty heavy thing to think about. Based on what you've seen, and Suzanne, I'll continue with you with this question, and maybe some other research that you considered when you were looking at this, could we expect to see these kinds of impacts in other places that have extremely restrictive abortion access?
Yeah, I would say so. The same potential mechanisms would lead us to suspect we could see similar increases in infant mortality in other states that banned abortion, particularly if we're seeing similar increases in live births in these places as we did in Texas following SB 8. Right now, there are 14 states with complete abortion bans, with few exceptions for things like fetal anomalies. And there's another 7 states, I believe, that have abortion restrictions pre-viability, and in some cases, many weeks before we would even be able to test for these sorts of congenital malformations that we think are the main mechanism explaining these increases in infant mortality. So we would expect to see something similar play out in other settings where abortion has been banned.
And now, Allison, I'll go to you. Could you talk about maybe where you'd like to take this research next? It seems like there's a lot more to unpack here.
There is a lot more to unpack. So I think one of the first things that we're going to be doing is looking at the impact of DOPS on infant mortality, as Suzanne just alluded to. So we're going to be looking at other states. And then secondly, we're now getting some data specifically for the state of Texas and others that will allow us to maybe disentangle maybe certain subgroups that were more impacted. Suzanne did note that infant mortality is a rare outcome, but we're trying to use some innovative methods to really see if there's something going on with certain subgroups. And that's work that we're doing right now. And then, yes, one other thing that I wanted to note is that we are thinking about looking at morbidity as well in the infants. So we know that infant death is really just the tip of the iceberg. We think that there are several more infants that are being impacted by certain types of morbidity that might have lifelong consequences. That's something else that we plan to look at when data become available.
Well, this is really important research because it is showing us, as we've talked about, these real-world impacts of legislation and how quickly they are becoming known when something goes into effect. So we will certainly continue this conversation as you find out more. Thank you so much, Suzanne Bell and Allison Gemmill.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks for having us.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production management by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send us an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.